who is a skinny, unaccomplished, starving orphan that Tevye brought in to take care of. He raised this kid, and they grew up together as brother and sister, and so she falls in love with the tailor Mutl Chemzoil. And Tevye asks the obvious question: why would you give up a match to the wealthy, well-off, well-possessed butcher Laser Wolf to marry a skinny, unaccomplished, starving tailor? And she gives the answer which changes the world. She says, because I love him. To which Tevye responds with the words of the great sage Tina Turner. What's love got to do with it? What's love but a second-hand emotion? You don't marry somebody you love. You marry out of a sense of duty, responsibility, a sense of obligation. You marry the person your father chooses. You don't marry who you love. And she says, no, Papa, it's a different world. I love him. Now, that word, I love him, I want you to think back to the Garden of Eden, to the eating of the fruit, right? When Eve eats the fruit, it says in the Torah, right? She saw that the fruit was tasty, she saw that it was beautiful, and she saw that it was a source of wisdom. But what's amazing about that verse, it's chapter 1, verse 26, I think, or 27, in the first chapter of Exodus, in second chapter, chapter 2, verse 27. What's amazing is that it's she who sees it. It's the birth of the thinking, the independent, individuated self. The birth of an individuated self is the beginning of modernity. The self that says, I will choose my own destiny. You will not choose it for me. I will decide what my path in life is. I will not accept the script that tradition has written for me. I will make my own decisions. I exist. And the fact that romantic love in the play is the symbol of it is very important, because what is romantic love? It's about it's emotions, it's feelings, it's totally internal, and it's totally unpredictable. I mean, all of us know people who married people and we all went, totally unpredictable. Because that's what romantic love, that's romantic, that's what makes it romantic, right? That's the beginning of modernity, the choosing self. So that as you enter modernity, you end up in a situation where it's no longer that you're going to live the life of your parents. Tradition no longer dictates your life. If your father was a tailor, you're a doctor. If your father was a butcher, you're a lawyer. And if your father was a lawyer, you're an actor, or a poet, If your father was a rabbi, a baker, you're a rabbi, So you now decide your own course of life. And America is the place of this autonomy. The sociologists call it the sovereignty of self. This autonomy goes crazy, right? When I first moved to LA, I thought this was great. I was driving down Santa Monica Boulevard. I moved back to LA. I grew up here, but I moved back in 1990, and I'm driving down Santa Monica Boulevard, and it's still there. There's a huge billboard for a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon. There's actually one across the street here. Like coming down Ventura Boulevard. Think about this as nothing wrong with cosmetic surgery. I'm all for it. But think about this as a cultural artifact, right? You not only can decide your values, your profession, your way of making a living, your politics. You don't have to live with the body you were born with. You want it bigger, smaller, we reduce, we turn, we make a tuck, a nip, and boom, you're somebody else. You don't have to live with the tuchas you were born with. You can choose your own tuchas. I mean, this is America. This is tzeitel, right? Your politics, your values, your lifestyle, your religion, your way of life, your profession, and your appearance are all chosen. Choice is what makes modernity, right? So there's a great sociologist named Peter Berger who writes a very famous book called The Heretical Imperative. Heresy, the word heresy comes from the word for choice, which means that you can't dictate somebody's religion. It's all chosen. It's all chosen. So that you become a choosing people, not just a chosen people, you see? This is the first step of modernity. And the second step of modernity is the second daughter. So Tzeitel and Motl Chemzoil get married. And meanwhile, what's happened is that Tevye has an open house because he has nothing, so he can share it. So a kid named Perchik is running away from the Tsar's police, right? And Perchik needs a place to stay, so he finds a place to stay in Tevye's house, right? And Perchik is a revolutionary, and during Zeitel and Mottl's wedding, Perchik crosses the barrier and asks Hodel, the second daughter, to dance. Right? Woo, scandal, Mixed dancing, right? And pretty soon everyone's dancing with everybody. It's a new world. And Perchik represents, as a revolutionary, as a Bolshevik, a second move of modernity, which is to say, I refuse to let God be the only actor in the world. Traditional Jewish theology said, God is the historical actor, and we're all here to wait for God to bring Messiah. But Perchik represents the second move of modernity, which is, I will take control of my world. I'm not going to wait for God. So Zionism and capitalism and socialism and Bolshevism, all of the isms of the 19th century are an expression of this movement of saying, I'm not going to wait for God to bring redemption. I will bring redemption myself. Zionism in particular. I mean, today Israel is at the core of American Jewish identity. But for a very long time, and some of you are old enough to remember, it wasn't. In fact, it was a heretical movement. It was a revolt against traditional religion. It was a revolt against tradition, because tradition said, who the hell are you to bring, to bring Israel back to Israel, to bring the people Israel back to the land of Israel? Only God can do that. Again, some of us are going to be with AIPAC. You're going to see that the biggest demonstration against AIPAC is not from the Palestinians, it's from the Hasidim. They come every year and they stand outside. You can tell they're dressed, sort of appropriately. That's Perchik. That's the second move of modernity. And the third one is Chava. Now, Chava is a bookworm, right? She's always got her nose in a book, and the books are kept in the library, and the library is part of the church. So she finds her way to the library, and there she falls in love with Fietka, who's a Russian boy. Now, this represents a double move. First this is the opening of the Jewish mind. For most of the Jewish Middle Ages, we only talk to ourselves. You only talk to yourself. You can only have a certain kind of conversation. It's a closed conversation. But from beginning modernity, we begin to open ourselves to the ideas of the world. And suddenly, any truth that the Jewish tradition claims has to be measured against all the ideas in the world. It's one thing to say to each other that we're a chosen people, that God chooses us, that we're better than everybody else. V'hivdil lanu min hatoim, says the prayer book, right? God distinguished us from those who make mistakes. It's much different when you start to meet people of other faiths and other cultures and other traditions, and you realize, first of all, they have things to teach us. And they're not toim. They're not mistaken. And what does it mean to say I'm a chosen person? And then what happens when you add to that all of the sciences, all the contemporary, not only physical sciences, but it's more importantly social sciences. You discover that every tribe in every corner of the world called itself a chosen people. Navajos call themselves chosen people. And they have a very interesting name, Navajos, for people who are outside of their circle. They call them Goyim. Polynesians have a name for themselves, right? And they have a name for people outside. Every tribe, Norse people having, everybody has that same sense of tribal affiliation. So now how do you understand yourself in the gamut of world cultures? It's a very different way of being Jewish. And then, of course, there's a mixing not only of cultures, but there's a mixing of families. The question of whether Tevye can accept the relationship. Tevye could accept Motl Chemzoil, and Tevye could even accept Perchik, but could Tevye accept Fietka? This is a very interesting question at the end of the play. I think it's different in the end of the play and the end of the movie. Because in the movie, he says, come with us. In the play, I think he doesn't. Is that right? Did I get that right?
According to the movie,
yeah.
When she decided to marry the Russian kid, Tuvia sat Shiva on a little bench.
Yeah.
At the end of the movie, she left him, by the way.
Yeah.
She leaves him. And as the cart is going away to come to America,
yeah.
the little bench falls off the wagon.
All right, yeah.
It's over.
Right. It's just an interesting, so I'm just quickly suggesting that Fiddler is an interesting outline for understanding the change that comes to the world. Now, for our purposes, the question is, once you enter a world where the self is the primary reality, where we're not going to wait for a God to change history, and where we're open to the truth claims of many, many peoples and cultures and sciences, now what happens to our sense of God? What happens to devotion? And there's one more little teeny piece of this, which goes beyond, which is not little, of course, which is that in the middle of the 20th century, you have these two great crises. tremendous crises that we still haven't recovered from. The Holocaust and the rebirth of the State of Israel, which I submit to you is, in historical perspective, is the two greatest crises in the history of the Jewish people. I mean, the greatest destruction is the destruction of the temple in the year 70, and the Holocaust matches it, or exceeds it. And the greatest redemption is Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we'll yet see, we have to give it some time, but the creation state of Israel at least rivals it. The difference is that Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, and the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem took place 1,500 years apart. The Holocaust and the rebirth of the State of Israel take place in one decade, in one generation's experience. How do you live with that? How do you live with that? So Yitz Greenberg, who's been our guest here many times, who's an Orthodox rabbi, says it surprises him that we say the same prayers now that we did before. He says even among the Reform, he says it's hard for him to believe that the prayer book hasn't changed more than it did, that the way of Jewish devotion hasn't changed more, because it changes our whole way of thinking. So in addition to the crisis of modernity, you have these two historic crises which leave us with a sense of bewilderment of where we are in the world, which is all a nice way of saying it doesn't surprise me that Jews have trouble praying. It doesn't surprise me that we don't have the same sense of connection and devotion to prayer that our great-great-grandparents did, because we're living in a different moment of history, and we have a different sense of ourselves and a different sense of our place in the world. So the question is, what is devotion in this moment? Where is devotion in this moment? So I thought I'd bring you two friends to talk to us, okay? I put them on opposite sides of the papers so they don't get along. Abraham Heschel on one side and Harold Schulweis on the other. Harold Schulweis stepped into Abraham Joshua Heschel's class at JTS in 1945, and they didn't get along. They didn't get along till much later, when Rabbi Schulweis went back and rediscovered Heschel, and they became close again, but at the beginning. So let's begin with Heschel. Heschel is, there's two things you need to know about Heschel just to get into it. First of all, last week we looked at the Hasidic sources. Heschel is a Chassid. Heschel is a Chassid, and you'll recognize some of those themes of the Hasidic prayer tradition in Heschel. But the second thing about Heschel that I think is interesting is Heschel belongs to a certain class of European philosophers who look at modernity from the point of view of religious life and are trying to explain religious life, or their own religious life, to people who are modern and to people who have a hard time understanding why you are religious. And the way that they do it is by saying that there are actually two modes of being in the world, two ways of thinking about life. And what happens is that modernity has embraced one and neglected the other. Modernity has privileged one over the other, and in doing so has left behind a way of being that is part of the repertoire of human experience. Martin Buber offers us this idea of that all life is about relationships, and there's two principal kinds of relationships, I-it and I-thou. And I-it relationships are relationships of function, where we use something, or we use somebody. And modernity is very good at this. We create all kinds of impersonal, functional relationships with each other. I-thou, he says, this is a much more rarefied experience where we truly discover who we are and we truly bond with another, and that's real. And what he tries to understand is that religion is about that. Is about the realm of the I-thou, but modernity doesn't understand that. It doesn't have patience for the I-thou relationship. Similarly, you have in a different idiom, but in a similar structure, you have a great Orthodox philosopher named Joseph Soloveitchik, Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, who was the Rav of Yeshiva University. And he understands that human beings have two characters. We have two characters in us. He uses the Bible story of Adam, and he sees that there's two stories of the creation of man in the Bible. So he calls it Adam 1 and Adam 2. Adam 1 is majestic man who enters the world, gains power in order to control the world. That's modernity. But there's another one called Adam 2, which is the person who realizes that he's unique and alone in the world and seeks the company of another and seeks the validation of God. And that is a whole different way of being, which modernity just doesn't get. Heschel is part of that same sort of approach, where he's going to say that there's really two different approaches in the world. One is the sort of scientific way of knowing the world, which is gaining power over the world. But then there's another way of knowing. And religion religion is a way of knowing the world. And here's another way of knowing. And by not advancing that way of knowing, we've lost a part of ourselves. He used to have a shtick. All good speakers have shticks. So he was a little teeny guy with a long gray beard. Look prophetic in his later years. And he would come to a seminary or a synagogue or a church or university, and he would begin a lecture with a breathless statement. He'd say, "Ladies and gentlemen, a great miracle just happened." And the audience would be silent. Like, what miracle? Like, what did we miss? And he'd say, "The sun just went down." And you'd look at him like half the audience thought he was nuts. And the other half of the audience said, like, what did he mean? And he'd begin to talk about how a religious person sees the world. And as he began to see how a religious person sees the world, you realize that the fact that the sun went down and you didn't rush to the window to go see it means that something's been lost in you. A part of your humanity has been lost in you, and that's the part that religion responds to. So here's a couple of pieces from Heschel. The first piece is from his book, God in Search of Man, which was written in 1964. And the second piece is from an essay, actually an address that he made to my union, to the Rabbinical Assembly in 1953 about Jewish prayer. So here's basically Heschel's outlook on the world. Ready? And with Heschel, you've got to sip it very slowly. He's more poetic than philosophical. So you read a line, stop, sort of, have you ever have good wine? Anyone ever go to dinner and your business partner bought you like a good bottle of wine? So you know how you sip it. You let it like get air in the glass. And, right, so ready? Here's line one. Ready? Wonder, which he translates as radical amazement, like regular amazement isn't good enough. It's got to be radical amazement, is the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude toward history and nature. Okay, stop a second. Take that in. Wonder, which he translates as radical amazement. How would you describe that? The oh wow moment is the chief characteristic of religion. Now, that's kind of an odd statement. If I ask you just off the cuff, what's the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude? You would say faith, belief, affiliation, observance, all kinds of things. But very, very few of us would say wonder. I mean, I went to Hebrew school for a long time. I went to seminary, for God's sake. The only wonder we ever had at JTS was I wonder if it'll snow and I won't have to go teach Hebrew school today. I wonder when this class is going to be over, right? I mean, when has wonder ever been part of your religious life? But here's his notion, that the cultivation of an oh wow sensibility is what religion is all about. The religious person walks around going, woo. Now, who has that sensibility naturally? Children do. You give a kid a Hanukkah present, he plays with it for 5 minutes, and then he jumps in the box. Whoa, it's a box. It's a fire engine. It's an airplane. It's a house. It's a fort. It's a castle. The kid has if you want to see the greatest thing in the world, I do this. I come down, I visit all the time. I visit classrooms. When a bug crawls into a classroom, right? So half the kids are afraid. It's a bug. But then there's this bunch of kids who will go, whoa, look at that. Because there's nothing more amazing than a bug, right? And you follow it on the floor. It's just amazing. So what happens? We all began that way. When we were 3, we all had that whoa, wonder. What happened? We all went to college. That's what happened, right? University will beat this out of you, right? Now look at the next line. Ready? One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted, regarding events as a natural course of things. So what's the opposite of religion? The opposite of religion is not secular, profane, skepticism, disbelief, atheism. The opposite of religion is boredom. Boredom. It's a person who walks through life going, ho-hum. Nothing here for me. Right? Nothing here. There's nothing here that arrests my attention. There's nothing here that makes me stop and look. There's nothing here for me. Boredom is the opposite of religion. right? To find an approximate cause of a phenomenon is no answer to his ultimate wonder, right? Read Walter Isaacson's biography of Einstein. Isaacson does a pretty good job explaining the physics. But what's more is Isaacson is fascinated with Einstein's religious life. Because the only way to get to be Albert Einstein is to have a constant sense of, oh, wow. And every time Einstein reached a certain understanding of something, it was only the beginning of a whole nother realm of stuff to understand. Right? To find that there's a law, a pattern in nature doesn't end your sense of, oh, wow. Right? Right? He knows that there are laws that regulate the courses of natural processes. He's aware of the regularity and pattern of things. However, such knowledge fails to mitigate his sense of perpetual surprise at the fact that there are facts at all. Perpetual surprise. Religion is about the cultivation of a sense of perpetual surprise. Right? To walk the world and go, ooh, wow. Right? And now he talks about what happened. The next line, the next paragraph. I actually put this on my desk. This is one of those quotes on my desk. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. Translation: the more education you have, the more boring you are. Right? Because anything that you see in the world, you go, ho-hum, I have a box to put that in. Right? That doesn't surprise me anymore. Right? Little kids, like everything is new to them. As you get older and you get wiser, you get boringer, you know. Such a decline is an alarming symptom of our state of mind. Mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness lies in understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. What we lack is not a will to believe, but a will to wonder. So now you get a sense of where Heschel might come when it talks about prayer. What is prayer? If I wanted to recover a sense of wonder in you, what would I do? I would give you a set of rituals which force you to stop the routine of your life and pay attention. And I would give you clues to what to pay attention to. Right? So I suggested to you about 3 weeks ago that what we call the bracha formula, Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam, was an answer that Yochanan ben Zakkai and his rabbinic colleagues came up with to the question that the generation of the destruction of the temple asked, you know, where is God now that the temple is destroyed? And the answer is God is within any phenomenon that you're facing. You get a sense now of where Heschel comes from a very Hasidic place, which is to say that Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam is a way of saying, stop a minute and look, there's something remarkable here. Something remarkable is happening here. Oh, wow. Right? Oh, wow. And to regain that sense of the I remember just quickly, when my kids were born, I was the first generation of daddies that were allowed into the delivery room, which was like an amazing experience. You know, you take the class and they certify, you put on the scrubs and you wash your hands real good. You sit there and you watch the baby come into the world. And the amazing thing was so I'm going nuts because I'm a new father and I'm dancing around the room. And the nurses danced with me. And for a moment, I stopped and said, it must take something very special to be a delivery nurse, because you do this 100 times a day, and you're willing to receive my sense of wonder at the birth of my child, and now saying, all right, this is number 12, in a 24-hour shift. You're dancing with me. You're dancing with me, and so you have to have this constant sense of wonder. So this is what prayer is for Heschel. Now you're saying to yourself, I go to shul. The only time I have wonder is I wonder how long this is going to take, right? I wonder when this damn thing's going to be finished, right? I wonder who thought this up, 3.5 hours of liturgy, Awareness of the divine begins with wonder. It's a result of what man does with his higher incomprehension. That's a sweet phrase. So what he's saying is, you have two modes in the world. One mode is the knowing mode, which is I grasp the world, I categorize the world, I analyze the world, I gain power over the world. The other way of knowing the world is to not grasp it, not to categorize it, not to analyze it, but to have wonder about it, to look at it and go, oh, wow. And you can have the same thing, right? I mean, the person who is an analytics scientist 6 days a week, can step back on the seventh and go, oh, wow, right? That's the oscillation. That's the rhythm of the thing. And so he calls this radical amazement. This is the radical amazement. Now, Heschel makes a claim, which is a very radical claim. If you look at the end of it, he says, this is an insight we gain in acts of wonder, not to measure meaning in terms of our own mind, but to sense a meaning infinitely greater than ourselves. So for Heschel, the wonder experience leads you to a sense that everything is meaningful. That everything is meaningful. Now, just take a second. God for Heschel is a very interesting thing, and I'll give you this another time. But for Heschel, the notion is that by sensing that meaning, that sensing that this is important, by sensing that this is attached to a greater meaning, Heschel understands that at the core of reality there is a God for whom all of this is something. And that what we're connecting with at that moment is that God. Now, what is that God? For Heschel, what he argues is the only thing you can know about God is that God cares. And that when you care, you're imitating God. You're actually channeling God in the world. So the ultimate end of prayer is to feel the presence of that caring God behind the discrete phenomenon of the world that we live in. So now we come to his argument. So this article, which was a speech he gave to the Rabbinical Assembly in 1953, and by the way, and Mark will appreciate this, when you're a speaker in the world, you get invited to come give talks in synagogues and organizations, right? So it is a compliment to get invited once. It is a greater compliment to get invited twice, to get invited back. But the greatest compliment, yes, that's right, because the greatest compliment of all is to get invited once and they'll never even think of having you back again. Because that's when you know you told them the truth they didn't want to hear. Heschel has a book called The Insecurity of Freedom. It's a wonderful book. And it's filled with all the speeches he made to all the organizations who never invited him back. Right? It's called The Insecurity of Freedom, okay? He gave his speech to the Federation. The General Assembly of the Federation world has a big meeting every year called the General Assembly. It's a little pretentious, And in 1964, the General Assembly was held in Montreal, and he was the keynote speaker. And in 1964, he said, I want to abolish two words from our vocabulary, survival and statistics. He says, stop talking about the survival of the Jewish people and stop quoting me statistics. The problem is whether Jewish life means anything to anybody, and all of your computers in the world aren't going to tell you that. Like, that was the last time you ever talked to those people, right? This one is the only time he ever got invited to the Rabbinical Assembly. Because the beginning of the essay, he starts out by, this is great, he starts out by saying, the modern synagogue has caught a cold. He said, you walk into a synagogue and everything is precise and decorous and orderly and calm, and no one's crying and no one's laughing and no one's clapping and no one's singing. Everyone's standing up and sitting down on cue. He says, that's not prayer. And that's the last time you ever got invited to those people, right? Right? So this is the essence of prayer. He gives you the essence of prayer here. Throughout many centuries of Jewish history, the true motivation for prayer was not the sense of being at home in the universe, but the sense of not being at home. The purpose of prayer was not to celebrate that we belong. It's to celebrate something that's wrong with the world. We could not but experience anxiety and spiritual homelessness in the sight of so much suffering and evil, in the countless examples of failure to live up to the will of God. The experience gained in intensity by the soul-stirring awareness that God himself was not at home in the universe, where his will is defied and his kingship is denied. To pray, then, means to bring God back into the world, to establish his kingship, and his glory prevail. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah means let God's name be made bigger. So Heschel says, what does those words mean? It means that you look at the world and you see there's not a lot of God left in the world. And your job when you pray is to invite God back into the world. Great is the power of prayer, for to worship is to expand the presence of God in the world. Now for him, God means God is experienced in a sense of wonder, and then part of wonder, the result of wonder is a sense of caring, of commitment. God is transcendent, but our worship makes him immanent. This is implied in the idea that God is in need of man. His being immanent depends on us. May there be more of God in the world. Decisive is not now this is interesting because he's a chassid, so you wouldn't expect him to say this. Decisive is not the mystic experience of our being close to God. Decisive is our feeling of, is not our feeling, but our certainty of God's being close to us. Although even his presence is veiled beyond the scope of our emotion. Decisive is not emotion, but conviction. If such conviction is lacking, if the presence of God is a myth, then prayer to God is a delusion. If God is unable to listen to us, then we're insane in talking to him. So what does Heschel say right away? He says you got to get your relationship with God straight before you can pray. Because if you don't have a deep sense of the presence of God in your life, then prayer doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, which I think is the modern problem. And so he's going to try to come back and give us back a sense of God in the world. And for him, God begins in that sense of wonder. The true source of prayer is not an emotion, but an insight. Now, what is insight? That's an interesting phrase. Insight is a kind of knowing, okay? But it's not a kind of knowing based on facts. It's not a kind of knowing based on deduction. It's not a kind of knowing based on observation. It's a kind of knowing that it's an intuition. It's an intuition, right? Like what happens to the young father watching his child being born, right? What happens to the parents of a bar mitzvah watching the kid get up? What happens to us when we see the world? We have sort of intuitions about what's going on here. And that something is going on here which is bigger than ourselves, bigger than our own comprehension. That's Heschel's idea of insight. It is this insight into the mystery of reality, the sense of the ineffable. That's a phrase he likes to use a lot, and no one knows what it means. Ineffable means unexpressible. Now, it's an irony that, he writes a 400-page book about that which is ineffable, right? Tom Lehrer. Remember Tom Lehrer, the folk singer? He says people complain they can't communicate. He says if you can't communicate, the least you can do is shut up. So Heschel writes a 400-page book on the ineffable. Now, what does he mean by the sense of the ineffable? Okay? So go back to these experiences of wonder. Okay, those of you who are grandchildren, holding your grandchild for the first time. And those of you who've been in nature, the first time you woke up in Yosemite Valley, right? Or those of you who have had tragedies in your life and have stood at the graveside of someone that you love, right? The sense of the ineffable, Heschel says, is a real human sense. So you have 5 senses, sight and taste and touch and hearing. And you have this other one called this sense of the ineffable, which is a sense of intuiting the meaning of that which is going on around you. And that the meaning is greater than yourself, that you're not alone in the world, but there's something bigger going on. That's what he means by the sense of the ineffable. It's a very important phrase to him because for him, it's our way of connecting with that which is greater than ourselves. That's the way of faith. That's the way of religion. So prayer, it is an insight into the mystery of reality, the sense of the ineffable that enables us to pray. So if we were really to pray Heschel style, what I would make you do is to go back in your own memory and gather in one of those moments. If you can gather in a set of those powerful moments. Now, what the prayer book is supposed to do is give us the moments that the collective, the Jewish people, experienced. Those moments, right? As long as we refuse to take notice of what is beyond our sight, beyond our reason, as long as we are blind to the mystery of being, the way of prayer is closed to us. So if you come to prayer service and you say, this is going to lower my cholesterol or relieve my stress, if you have a sort of, empirical reason to pray, it's not going to work. Prayer is not getting benefits like that. I mean, you want to lower your cholesterol, exercise, Don't take the rabbi's advice. You want to lower, this is not going to raise the stock market, but if you want to gain a sense of what's beyond you, of a meaning beyond you, says Heschel, this is what prayer is about. If the rise of the sun is but a daily routine of nature, there's no reason to say the prayer, in mercy thou givest light. The problem is not how to revitalize prayer. The problem is how to revitalize ourselves. So Schulweis, at one of his sermons, after having reintroduced himself to Heschel, gave a talk once where he said, you tell me that prayer is boring. I think you're boring. Now and that's a gutsy thing for a rabbi to say. Well, he had a long contract, and you weren't going to fire him. But the notion of saying, it's not that the prayer book is dull, or the prayer experience, it's that we aren't attuned to it. So the move is, leave the prayer book alone. Attune yourself to it. You see, Change you. You got to change your head in order to find this. And as long as you don't, you're missing some part of your own humanity, he says. Let us begin to cultivate those thoughts and virtues without which our worship becomes of necessity a prayer for the dead, for ideas which are dead to the heart. So that's Heschel. Heschel's notion is to recover that sense, that part of our humanity which is attached to worship. That's the only way for a modern person to approach prayer. Because modernity is a crisis in our collective history which has blocked out that whole side of us. That whole side of us. And we're missing it now. To pray without that part of you is to do an empty act. Now turn the page over. Schulweis comes from the exact opposite point of view. Okay? Schulweis, who was the student of Mordechai Kaplan, and has a very different point of view. For Schulweis, the question is not how to change the person. For Schulweis, the question is how do you change the prayer? Okay? So let's take a look at this. Anyone have a question so far? I'm doing a great job of... Mark, do you want to say something? Yeah. You say something. Go on.
My next children's book is called Thanks, Gimme, Oops, and Wow.
Thanks, what? Gimme,
Oops,
and wow. Thanks, gimme, oops, and wow.
which are the only 4 kinds of prayer.
Right.
And so it comes from teaching adults and then finally learning enough to be able to teach children. And the point is, the mistake in my view, is talking about prayer as if it's a thing. One thing. It's actually 4 things. And each thing has its own motivation. Thanks involves understanding we've been given something that we didn't deserve. There is a legitimate role of prayer. Giving. Bakashot, petitionary prayer,
Right.
are a definite real thing.
Right.
Not, oh Lord, why don't you give me a Mercedes-Benz, but heal my father.
Right.
Right? Heal Tommy.
Uh-huh.
Oops is the failure to be a decent human being. And we say it and then we do it. And then wow, which is what you've been brilliantly talking about.
Yeah.
This childhood wonder at things that weren't given to you. It's not a thanks. Wow is not thanks. Wow is something that's given to everyone.
Right.
And beyond that, I think Heschel is beautiful and utterly incongruent.
A lot of people think that.
I believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. Very poetic.
You are complicated.
I am trying to figure him out.
You are much better.
Ronnie.
Heschel is putting religion in competition with science.
Yeah, that's a good question. But I want to just correct it just a little bit. Not competition with science.
Well, prayer is like experiment.
Here's what happens. Wonder, I think he would say, wonder is the beginning of both. Okay? The sense of, oh wow. In a certain way, I would argue, and you would tell me you're better than me, you began with a sense of, oh wow, which is what sent you to medical school. Right? A doctor has a sense of, oh wow, all the time. Except one answer to, oh wow, is, I wonder how this thing works. Right? The kid who tears apart his clock. Right? I tore a radio apart once for Hanukkah. Drove my mother crazy. But I want to know how this thing works and how I can make it better. Right? You're a physician. You want to know how the body works. Oh, wow. And how can I make it work better? That's science, right? But when you step back and you don't mess with it, you don't take it apart, but you just enjoy its being, and you say, boy, what a piece this is. What a thing. That's a different oh, wow. That's a religious oh, wow. Science is one answer to wonder. Religion is another. What his problem is that modernity, the world we live in, privileges science and doesn't privilege the other one. Right? It doesn't understand the poetic sense of, oh, wow. It doesn't understand that. It immediately, we want to tear the thing apart and figure out how it works and gain power over it, you see? So I don't think they're in competition. I think they're 2 different modes of responding to the world, and we live in a world where one is privileged, where one is accepted, where one is rewarded and the other's not. Okay? Someone else had a question. I want to make sure. Okay, so turn the page. So here's Schulweis, okay? So what's Schulweis's basic attitude? Heschel is going to say, of course, there's these two ways of knowing. And the way of knowing that modernity has left behind is what I want to teach you. Schulweis is in a different place. Schulweis wants to say that I want religion to respond to that which I already know. I want religion to respond to my world. I want it to make sense to me. I want a religion that's intelligent. I don't want a religion that's mystical, that's strange. I want a religion that makes some sense. So here's a couple of things he says about prayer. First of all, prayer is not magic. There was a Dear Abby. Remember Dear Abby? So Dear Abby, last night I walked into my daughter's bedroom and she was beside her bed praying her evening prayers. And Dear Abby, she was praying her heart out for a pony. She asked God to give her a pony. Dear Abby, we are in no position to get our daughter a pony, but I am afraid that when she doesn't get a pony on Christmas, she's going to give up her belief in God. What should I say to my daughter when she asks, why didn't God fulfill my prayer? Puzzled in Detroit, right? Dear Puzzled in Detroit, tell your daughter that God hears all prayer, but God said no. Interesting, right? God said no. And you'll find this in many parenting books, right? Now, so Schulweis takes this and says, that's an interesting idea. God said no. What happens if 25 years from now, little Susie is praying not for a pony, but because her mother's deathly ill? And Susie's praying for mom to get better. And mom doesn't get better. Would we say to her, God said no? And at that point, Susie's going to say, well, why did God say no? Mom deserved to get better. Mom is a wonderful person. Is it something that mom did to deserve God's wrath? Or something that I did? And then Susie takes upon herself all of the sort of guilt of am I being punished? Right? I remember I once heard, remember this guy Bernie Siegel? He's a surgeon in Connecticut, and he wrote all these wonderful books about healing. Love, Healing, and Miracles or something. And he wrote this whole thing about how people, there was this fellow that, what was the guy, a famous guy, he had cancer and he watched funny movies, Norman Cousins, and he watched all these funny movies and it made him better. And Bernie Siegel writes about it. And so Harold wrote about this, and I met Bernie Siegel. I had this interesting conversation with him because I said, Bernie, if you tell people that they have the healing power within them and they don't get better, they say, boy, not only do I suck at life, I suck at healing. I mean, you make them feel worse. God said no is based on the presumption that God could have said yes. That God controls it all. But God decided that you don't deserve God's grace. Is that really what you want to say to somebody? Right? I ask the question to kids all the time. Suppose you have a test and you don't study because you want to watch television. So in the morning when the test comes in, you make a big prayer. Right here. Come on. Right here, come on. Your bubby is here. Go sit with your bubby and learn something, young person. Yay, good. See, ineffable. This is the sense of the ineffable. And if my kids would get off the stick, I would have ineffable too. All right. You hear that? All right. You say to the kid, before the teacher gives the test, you make a prayer to God, dear God, please, 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 please give me an A. Will you get an A? And the kid says, of course not. I said, why not? He says, you should have studied. Right? Here's what Schulweis writes. Ready? Prayer is not magic. This is petitionary prayer. This is please, right, in Mark's vocabulary. We must distinguish prayer from magic. Magic uses formulas, charms, incantations that are thought to exercise power that can influence outcomes. Magic is concerned with changing the external world. Magic ends to produce desired results. Prayer is not wishing results. In authentic prayer as understood by the Jewish tradition, there are no shortcuts to desirable results. Prayer is concerned with energizing the means for us to achieve goals of worth. Means and ends. If prayer is about something I want to have happen in the world, that's magic, that's not prayer. Prayer is about means, is asking for what? So you ask the kid, well, if you can't pray for an A on the test, what can you pray for? And any kid will tell you, you pray for the diligence to turn off the television set and the discipline to sit down and study for your test. That's a different kind of prayer. That's a prayer directed not up, but inward. And that's Schulweis. For Schulweis, the God that Rabbi Schulweis worshipped is a God who lives within. We are created in the image of God, which means something to him, which means that we have capacities that we have not yet understood. We have the transcendence exists, transcendence which is that which is beyond, but it's within us. It's within us. So what prayer is trying to do is reach the transcendent within. The transcendent within is to enable me to do something I want to do, but I'm not sure I can do it. That's a prayer for means, not ends. Conventional teaching has tended to see prayer as magical intervention or as a way of denying the ways of nature. Traditional teaching battles against magical thinking, which ultimately leads to disillusionment with the self and the world. Right? Now, if you want to see the footnotes, I gave you the footnotes. These are his two favorite Talmudic sources on prayer. Right? Talmud Brachot. Right, it's actually a Talmud, it's actually the Mishnah, not even the Gemara. For rain and good fortune, one says, blessed is he that is good and bestows good. Baruch hatov u'meitiv. Right? For bad fortune, one says, Baruch dayan emes. But we are to say a blessing over evil as we say a blessing over good. But to cry over what has already passed is to utter a vain prayer, an empty prayer. The Hebrew is tfilat shav. Now, what do you mean tfilat shav? That means that the Talmudic tradition is establishing a limit on what you're permitted to pray for, because prayer has to be governed by a certain degree of intelligence, a degree of realism. You can't pray for that which has already been determined. Right? If a man's wife is pregnant and he says, God grant that my wife bear a male child, besides being sexist, right? This is an empty prayer. If you're coming home from a journey and he hears the cry of distress in the town and says, grant that this is not my house, that's an empty prayer. Because then it's somebody else's house, right? But really the point is that it's not the moral problem. The problem is that it's already... Here's the question. If you see a red light in your rearview mirror and you say, Rabbeinu Shalom, make it an ambulance. I understand the impulse, trust me. You know, you're doing 85 on the freeway, you know, and you see a red light in the mirror and you say, Rabbeinu Shalom, please make it an ambulance, you know. Is that, but that you understand that you can't make something different than what it is, right? Here's the other one. Here's the other one that Schulweis loves. This is a very famous source. A pagan philosopher asked a rabbinic elder in Rome, if your God has no desire for idolatry, why doesn't he abolish it? Right? So the rabbi replies, if people worship something the world didn't need, God would abolish it. But people worship the sun, moon, planets, and stars. Should he destroy the universe on account of fools? Right? The world pursues its natural course. That's a good phrase. Olam keminhago noheg. Maimonides loved that phrase because he was a doctor. The world pursues its course, and for fools who have acted wrongly, they have to render account. Now, the Talmud takes that idea and goes to the following conclusion, which is remarkable, really. Suppose a man stole a measure of wheat and went and sowed it in the ground. Dinhu shelo titzmach. If you steal seeds and you plant them, they shouldn't grow. If a God governs the universe and nature is the creation and tool of God in the universe, if you steal seeds, your stolen seed shouldn't grow. It shouldn't rain on the fields of the evil. Right? It should rain on the fields of the good, and the evil should start. But what happens? They grow. Why do they grow? Olam kamin hago noheg. Right? The world, nature doesn't know from good and evil. Nature's nature. Now he ups the ante. Suppose a guy goes and does his neighbor's wife. Could happen, you know.
I love the way he says that.
Why? I live in Encino. This happens all the time, you know. This is my neighborhood. What are you talking about? I watch HBO. Don't you watch HBO, you know? Dinhu shelo titaber. She should not get pregnant. Right? But she gets pregnant. Why does she get pregnant? Because sperms and eggs, like seeds, don't know from where they come. Because nature doesn't have morality. Now, if nature doesn't have morality, and the Talmud is willing to acknowledge that, you don't say to a child, God said no. It's not God's decision that mom gets better or worse. What do you say to the child? What do you say to the child? You say to the child, you know, when I was sick, I had these wonderful doctors and nurses and friends and neighbors and people who came to take care of me. They were my angels. Let's pray that your mother finds angels. Right? You ever listen to the prayer we say for sick people in the shul? This is one that Harold wrote. We pray for the skill of the physician. Right? We pray for the inner strength to fight the disease. We pray to say yes to life even when we're defeated. It's a sense of means, not ends. That's Schulweiss's idea. Magical thinking invites false hope and a dependence upon illusory means. It denigrates human knowledge and competencies that are required to achieve the ends desired. So what's the purpose of petitionary prayer? It's to find the part of us which is prepared to make the world over into the way we want it to be made over. It becomes a moral conversation. Prayer becomes a moral conversation. Now he expands upon that in the next line. So he talks about something called covenantal prayer. If I'm here and God's there, and all of my prayer is the prayer of a servant to a master, of a serf to a king, right? I'm asking the king to do for me what I need done. Right? Then I'm passive and I'm weak and God is all powerful. But if I'm covenanted, what does that change? How does that change my understanding of prayer? If I'm covenanted, then I am God's partner in the creation of the world. Then what is prayer? Prayer has to change if I'm covenanted. If I'm covenanted, I become part of the process. The best example of this is the blessing you say over bread. Right? You say, Amotzi lechem min haaretz. But wait a minute, lechem doesn't come out of the haaretz. Lechem doesn't come out of the ground. What comes out of the ground? Wheat. Try eating wheat. Wow. Right? What you do is you take wheat and then you make it something that's edible. That's a human experience, right? That's the human part of the covenant. Well, if you imagine that as what prayer is, now you end up with a very different conversation. So now you can begin to see the temperament of these two philosophers. Just quickly, we'll get back to Schulweis in a minute. The temperament is that for Heschel, what we're going to try to do is recover from modernity the sense of wonder of Hasidic sources in Jewish mysticism. And prayer is about wonder. For Schulweis, for modernity, we're going to try to celebrate the human moral contribution, the human moral action, human moral responsibility. And prayer becomes a moral conversation. It's a conversation about what do I need to do in the world. So he writes, do I hear my own prayers? So the question is, you say, does God hear my prayers? Do you hear your prayers? Do I know what I want and whether I want is worthy of being prayed for? That's an interesting question. Can I myself answer any part of my prayers? Like I once asked him, how do you pray? He says, it's really simple. I just add 2 words to every prayer. Through me. You know? Master of the world, sim shalom, bring peace. Through me. Rifa'enu Adonai v'niv Hashem. Bring us healing through me. See? Am I moved by my own prayers? Who am I who lifts his voice to prayer to another? What are my powers and my energies and my will, and how may they affect the outcome of the prayer that I may pronounce? These reflexive questions, reflexive means they're asked of me, will not be asked by the prayer model where piety is expressed as subservience. They will be asked in covenant model prayer where the petitioner views himself as an active correspondent of God. There is nothing that we can rightly pray for that doesn't make a demand on us. That's a very powerful idea. You can't pray and walk out of the shul the same way. Every prayer is a claim on yourself. The covenant model of prayer is not modeled after relationship of king to subject or master to servant or shepherd to flock. Covenanted prayer is two-sided relationship of co-creator and co-sanctifier. I am not the passive recipient of another's will, judgment, and act. I understand myself as an essential and active partner with the divine other. The prayer of dialogue increases the potency of the divine thou by raising the power and responsibility of the human partner to answer prayer. So now, it means that it's reflexive. It comes back to the self. That's a very different mode of prayer, a very different kind of conversation than one has when one thinks about praying to a God who controls the whole world. Yeah, Douglas.
Both Schulweis and Heschel seem to take an incredible amount of reflection in order to understand and do this.
Yeah.
And yet you go to Shul,
Yeah.
you turbo dog.
Turbo davening.
I mean, you can't think about what you're saying if you're going to say it at the pace that you go.
Yeah, yeah.
Even when I read the English, I find it, I can't keep up with it.
Yeah, orthodoxy, that's true, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, but that's why I got the phrase. That's why I came up with the phrase turbo davening.
Well, but here's the turbo davening. We can get into this, but I don't want to get too far into this. Remember, when I was a little kid, on Saturday afternoons, Mom would plant us in front of the TV set, and we would watch Leonard Bernstein's children's concert from Carnegie Hall.
Oh, I love that.
Me too. That's how I learned classical music. Leonard Bernstein, remember they're talking about? Leonard Bernstein, who was the conductor of the New York Symphony, New York Philharmonic, did children's concerts, and he would have, and he was, he was just genius, and he had a whole symphony orchestra to play with, and an audience full of kids, and he would take a piece of music and he would take it apart. Right, he did all kinds of things. It was great, So the problem is the following. If you slow down the davening, it sounds a little bit like, to a person who loves music, the children's concert's fine for children, but it's not what I go to the symphony to hear. You see? On the other hand, if I'm the person who doesn't really get classical music and I go to the symphony, it sort of washes over me the same way that you say turbo davening washes over you. So if you're the person who's conducting the orchestra, if you're conducting a service, who do I conduct it for? Do I conduct it for the connoisseur who came to hear the symphony? Or do I conduct it for those who sort of want to take the thing apart and go slow? And the answer is, I don't know. So you know what I did? I put one in one room and one in the other room, which is why we're going to leave in a minute. There's 5 different services going on in this building at this moment. Because there's different styles and needs of prayer. And I recognize that. And I think that's one of the classic conditions of modernity, which is that modernity has put us in a place, not just choice, but we're different. We come to this from different places, as opposed to my grandfather who walked in a shul and prayed, or my great-grandfather who walked in a shul and prayed, right? So what do we have? In modernity, we passed the threshold where this experience of prayer is no longer clearly understood. I mean, the fact that you have to explain it already tells you that it's no longer part of the cultural patrimony. It's not part of the heritage which you accept and do automatically. It's a strange thing, praying. Moderns don't understand it. For one thing, we think of ourselves as the center of our universe, not a God, as our ancestors might have done. And we think of ourselves as empowered, and we don't think of ourselves as powerless as our ancestors might have done. And we think of ourselves very, very differently. So we're not ready to speak in the same language of our ancestors. And so Heschel and Schulweis and others have tried to translate what this moment of prayer really means. For Heschel, it's to lose yourself in the wonder. And for Schulweis, it's to regain yourself and your empowerment in your own power to make the world over in a moral image, in the image of God. And they come together at a certain point. It's not that they're totally separated from each other, but they represent a modern sense of being alienated from this experience. So your experience is not wrong. It's an alienating experience and trying to sort of step back toward that experience. And I think it's going to take a while. I don't think we've figured it out yet. I think it's going to take a while. I think we're in process, but I think it's going to take a while. Any last comments or questions? Yes, please, Sally. Hi.
Change the subject for a moment. Could you explain to us the wisdom of AIPAC having trouble speaking?
I will pray. I will probably walk out of the room, too. The answer is, I believe that what AIPAC is trying to do is recognize that he is the presumptive and probable Republican nominee. I think they invited all of the candidates, and these are the 2 that accepted. And AIPAC wants to hear voices from left and right.
Who's the other one?
Hillary's speaking, and Biden's coming. And AIPAC wants to maintain close relations with the president, no matter which party that president comes from, because it's in the interest of the American-Israel relationship to maintain that relationship. Now, you and I and others many others may have difficulties with Mr. Trump or not. But the fact is that he is the presumptive nominee of one of the two great political parties of this nation. And if we're going to maintain a strong relationship between Israel and America, which is AIPAC's purpose, they need to build a relationship with him. And so they're going to invite him. So that's the answer. So now the question is, do you sit in the audience and listen to him? Do you bring a big sign? Do you walk out? Do you listen to him? Do you want to hear what he has to say? Is it important to hear what he has to say? I don't know. These are questions that all of us who are going to the conference are going to have to face next week. Yeah, please, Pop. Go ahead. Welcome back. This is my dad. He's back. So everybody say back then. Yeah. You were missed. Yeah.
Gave us permission
Yeah.
to accept God as the old man in the sky.
Yeah.
Gave us permission to do
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
When we need it.
Big mistake.
At
Go
that
ahead.
moment, when you're down, really down, and you're terrified
Yeah.
of what's going to happen,
Yeah.
when you make a petitionary prayer,
Yeah.
God save my child,
Yeah.
even though intellectually you don't accept it, but
Yeah.
emotionally
Yeah.
you wait a minute.
That-
As you take an aspirin to cut down pain a little bit,
Yeah.
that glimmer of hope,
Yeah.
gives you a little bit of relief.
Okay.
When the tragedy finally happens, then you can switch back to your intellectual concept of God.
Okay. Yeah, no, I get
A
it.
little moment, like
You're
an
right.
aspirin,
You're right.
cuts down the pain.
Yeah. Because there is a part of, I had a long, you remember I sat next to Harold on the pulpit for 25 years, right? And he's, for those of you who didn't know Rabbi Schulweis, prayer wasn't his favorite thing. Schmoozing was his favorite thing. So you'd sit down and for the next 2.5 hours, you tried not to, you tried to pay attention to your service, but he wanted to talk, right? So at one point we were talking about this, and I asked him, Harold, this is all fine and good, but don't you think people need myth? Don't you think people need don't you think prayer has a quality of make-believe to it that all of us need? After all, when I go to the theater, I know that the actor on the stage is not Othello, but I make believe that he's Othello, and I become part of the drama, and I can understand the heart of the character that Shakespeare wrote. I know that the kids on the stage are not Romeo and Juliet and really dying at the end of the play, but I make believe because that's the heart of the romantic experience of the theater. Isn't there a certain quality of drama and make believe? Okay? And he argued with me, and I argued back, and I realized that it's generational. He's rebelling against the mythical prayer of his grandfather, right? And I don't have to rebel as much as he does, so I can come back to that closer sense of the make-believe, right? It's, I think that's part of how I understand the prayer experience, which is a whole nother lecture, so let's stop here and we'll get on to that another time. Have a really good Shabbos, everyone. Take good care.